All right. First things first, it is definitely a pleasure to be here. I mean, we're all surrounded by so relevant people, entities, really making sure that we are living in a more secure, more free world where the values of democracy and, again, freedom are really standing and withholding everything that we're suffering today in the world. Unfortunately, I'm not a military. I'm not someone representing Europe, ENISA. I'm just a simple technology strategist. For those that might be asking yourselves what that is, that's a fancy name for kind of field CTO. And I work for SentinelOne, which is a cybersecurity software vendor, software as a service vendor. And the research today that I'm showing is actually powered by Sentinel Labs, which is our threat intel research team. So this was a conjunction or a collaboration work between me and them, and obviously this is only possible thanks to them. And hopefully this works. It does. Now, it's not without saying that obviously it is a bittersweet feeling to be here and be talking about these specific topics. And I'm pretty sure that you all feel that kind of tightened heart that I feel, that also we're not talking about the same typical concepts that we typically talk in the cyber security space or the cyberspace, which is like the cyber economical crime, data theft. This is actually affecting people, and it's my opinion that it's affecting people, health, safety, and lives much more than probably we can think of. And unfortunately, through these past 7 months, things are not looking, very bright in the end of the tunnel. There's like no end in sight for what is happening, and often things just escalate even more than we would wish for. Opa, this went like really straight to the end. What did I did? All right. Actually, it was my fault. It was an animation. If we actually look into the past unfortunate months, and I think this is like pardon me, like the analogy, but it's humans being bros. And we saw this like in COVID. We saw this now. It's at the worst of times that we actually see the best of ourselves. And specifically in the cyber community, we saw the best of ourselves. Like in the worst of times, we all banded together. Again, going back to team sports, definitely I can relate with that. All of these specific entities, private researchers, or independent researchers, that is, journalists, all came together to ensure that we had the right information, that we were sharing the right information for the greater good. Again, for the protection of the values that I just mentioned at the beginning. And I know that we shouldn't speak lightly the term war. I understand the controversy around it, but again, it's always a question of perspective. I'm pretty sure that if you ask someone in Ukraine, that they will have a specific saying about it, whether it's war or not war, whether it's cyber war or not cyber war. The reality is that unfortunately, once more, history has shown us that war is still present, more than we would wish for. Again, even though all of our advancements as society, but specifically, cyber war has gained a much more relevant place in the theaters, like the classical theaters that war is cited by, whether that is by air, land, no matter what. And again, the reality is that it has become way more dangerous, regardless of we thinking that it was a non-cyber Armageddon or not. The other point that I think it's important to mention here is that all of the research that I'll be obviously showing, and again, all of the information that we have access to, all of us collectively, at least the public available information, is always like a moving target. Every single week, new data points show up. So again, the validity of this information should always be testified or attested given the moment in time and the information that we have. Now, we had, and I could feel this in the room even today, that we had various opinions about how effective this cyber war was. And the reality is that, to an extent, and I could feel this, I'm not sure if you can feel the same as I, there's almost like this bizarre disappointment of things not being as we expected. Oh, they were not as efficient or proficient, as they were supposed to be, or like the attacks were not so damaging as we were expecting. Well, to an extent, thankfully, right? Whether that is because of better defenses that we had, whether it is because they were not so well organized or didn't have the right resources, we don't know. Again, those things are obviously speculatory or speculation. But even out there, the fact was that throughout the information channels, media, and all of the soapbox being like very strong opinions that each one of us have, there was like very disparate opinions of what and how damaging the cyber war was actually against Ukraine. Reality is, and I think this has been stressed throughout today, that we need to proceed with caution, and we need to at least give the credibility that things can escalate and things can become more damaging if someone eventually wants to or wants so. But we have to also understand that in these specific situations, in these specific scenarios that we are living, there is a lot of spray and pray disinformation. Some of it can be even like propaganda. But the truth is that many of that is simply not grounded in the truth of incidents. And I think that when we are talking about cyber war, and even more for like someone which is not within the InfoSec community, I'm not sure, like your family members, your friends, and they're trying to grasp how things are actually happening. And looking to the media, it's not easy to see that. It's not easy to read exactly what is happening. So again, it is important for collectively, when we are talking about cyber war, that we do so exactly based on the ground truth of incidents. Looking, and this is very important, looking at the timeline of the attacker preparation. It can be like years before the actual event. What rises above the threshold? Again, what's business as usual? What is not business as usual? Even if it's the slightest activity that we see out there. And also, like, what's the actual outlook? What's the objective? What are they trying to achieve if they are really successful accomplishing this? So it's not just a single take, it's a multi-layered cake here to actually be as factual, as precise as we need to be. All right, this is a very busy slide, I'll go through it, but this is a high-level timeline view of the cyber offensives that we've seen since February to late April, beginning of May. And I'll break it down for you really quickly. What you see there in the green bar is basically all of the pre-positioning activities that we've seen before the actual physical invasion. The red line is showing the 24th of February, again, the physical day where Russia invaded Ukraine. And you can actually see that some of the first activities, I don't have a laser point. I do? This is amazing. Oh, beautiful. Look at that. Technology works. And you can see there exactly like the first activities being done, but in terms of cyberspace, not in the physical realm, just before the physical invasion. So that red line and red dot, as I said, represents the 24th of February, and all of the kind of very directed destructive attacks happening against Ukraine. Then you have in blue, basically the barrage, the flood of crimeware and activism followed up exactly by the continuous kind of wind tunnel, like profiting of crime and cyber crime groups, just like using the general noise, the chaos within the cyberspace to conduct their own activities, and obviously going within their own objectives. Oh, by the way, and what you see in yellow is obviously cyber offenses against Ukraine, and in red, it's pro-Ukrainian activities. You can actually see there, for example, in the blue bar, there's two elements that I find really interesting, which is the leaks of the criminal organizations like Conti and TrickBot, which were kind of substantial as they were. Well, there's number animations. Sorry, I forgot about this. But I kind of break it down already. Now, it is true that there wasn't only Russian threat actor activity. There's actually a bit more than that. And these were all the threat actors that we tracked during these specific months that the team was kind of closed and enclosed, very focused on exactly collecting threat intelligence as much as possible to be shared. But there's obviously a big dog that I would state that it kind of jumps to the eye, and that's Sandworm. That's a Russian state black hat group, as we all know. And they were like probably one of the most prominent ones in this cyber offensive, in this conflict. And we're actually going to focus a lot on them throughout this presentation. Which takes us to wipers. We already had a sense of wipers today in other sessions, but this was actually one of the most used tactics as part of the cyber offensive, and specifically once more from Sandworm, to cause digital disruption against Ukraine, and eventually also physical damages, not only digital. And so, as we, and rightfully so, and I want to stress this out, dwell in cyber ranges for our own preparedness, and by the way, going back to the previous kind of four elements, the four core elements of looking into the attack timeline of the preparedness of the attacker, as we dwell in these cyber ranges for our own preparedness, and again, rightfully so, the fact is that threat actors are doing that with live-fire exercises. And history has shown us that, and like I said before, it is very important for us to actually go back, even if that's like years, to actually see why and how things were actually happening in February and the following months. And probably it's not very far away from your memories of when, in 2014, for example, the election commission was hacked in Ukraine, or when in 2015 and 2016, several types of attacks happened against state government agencies, media, hospitals, and last but not least, I think it was like 2 days before Christmas, the first known, at least publicly known, cyber offensive against a power central station that actually caused a blackout. So, but 2016 and 2017 actually set the tone for that preparedness. Again, there was another repeat of an attack against a central power station, this time in Kyiv, also resulting in a blackout. But then something else came along. And I'm pretty sure that this is, again, once more very close to everyone's heart here, that in, I think, June 7th, or 27th, that is, of 2017, Ukrainians, specifically at the beginning of the day, start seeing in their computers across all sorts of networks, private, public, government agencies, hospitals, etc., started seeing a message about an encryption malware. And by the way, for the people that actually don't know, Petya was an encrypting malware family that I think was discovered back in 2016. Now, the reality is that for those that recall, Petya was not a ransomware. It was actually a wiper. Because if you went through the process of paying the ransom and trying to recover your data, you would not be able to do so. It was basically unrecoverable. So it was a hidden objective, which was destruction of data, period. So that was like the first preparedness element exactly of wipers and how wipers were used in this specific cyber offensive. And I mean, as part of the spillage, because we all know like the nature of worms and malwares in the cyberspace, there's no boundaries. And again, we talked about like being as close to Estonia, to Canada in the cyberspace. This affected the entire world, not only Ukrainians, not only Ukrainian companies. And most definitely you'll recall companies like Maersk, that all got affected, FedEx and much more. Mondello, I even think, if I'm not wrong, really, really badly affected by this wiper. And fast forward to February 23rd, again, one day before the physical invasion, we saw exactly the same type of activities. This is a tweet from ESET Research, where, again, like I said, the collective, the team sports element here is really important. But ESET Research, together with Symantec, they started publishing specific file SHAs of malware activity that was being seen. Actually, it's kind of telling already because it's called kill disk. And that is what we eventually coined as hermetic wiper. Again, Sentinel Labs coined as hermetic wiper. Again, back then we thought that this was like really an interesting quirk. Like the icon embedded in the sample was this gift with a bow. It ends up, or ended up actually to be way more common than we thought. So if you scan through VirusTotal samples, this is something which is quite common. Still an interesting quirk. Now, hermetic wiper specifically was using kind of a well-tested and tried method of doing data destruction. They were using a legitimate, like a benign partition management driver coming from EaseUS to actually accomplish the more destructive elements of their attack, kind of also helping them to go under the radar of many detection solutions and possible IDS, IPS, and the like security tools. And by the way, if you're wondering why hermetic wiper, the actual sample was digitally signed by a certificate from DigiCert under the name of a company called Hermetica Digital Ltd. We know today that the company is a Cypriot company. Most definitely they were compromised or someone actually impersonated them beyond DigiCert to get the digital certificate, which eventually, very quickly, everyone prompted to be disregarded and obviously not being allowed to use. What you see here is the open handle empty driver. Actually, the file name was called emptydriver.sys, the partition manager driver that was used to accomplish those attacks. Now, this kind of follows what we call a school of wiping. If you look into Lazarus, for example, with Shamoon, it kind of followed exactly the same techniques of using a benign partition management driver to accomplish the destruction, like deleting MBR, partition tables, and really making sure that the recovery of those computers, those devices were simply not possible. Same thing happened with actually Lazarus Destover, APT33 Shamoon were kind of using the same tactics and techniques a couple of years back. So we call it like exactly the same school of wiping. You can see here, instead of the EaseUS, they were using Eldos, another partition management software, to actually accomplish the same goals. Now, hermetic wiper was being distributed by Hermetic Wizard. I love the names, by the way. And what you can actually see here, and these are very important details, that the earliest compilation time that we've seen from those samples of Hermetic Wizard were actually pointing to a day before. So this could show us that it's not Petya. Again, the full scope, the full focus of creating brand new tools for this specific offensive, right? Although naturally they were they were supporting themselves on the preparedness, on the elements that they've learned over the past couple of years, if not more than a couple of years. And again, Hermetic Wizard, or Hermetic Wiper in this case, I'm sorry, was just like the brink of months of data destruction attacks. This is a table from Microsoft. They also have a very good paper on the entire cyber offensive. And you can actually see this being divided by waves, by weeks, actually, which we call them waves. First notable thing, it's there highlighted, which was week 2. Apparently, there was like a pause in the cyber offensive operations. There was like no notable operations happening. But what you can also see and spot from this table is the actual number of cyber offensives decreased over time extensively. You can actually see there like 1, 2, 3, 4, like if not more, actually 22 destructive incidents versus 2. But The interesting element here is that the actual intended damage and types of target, they were increased in terms of impact. And so you can see there, for example, Carry Wiper and Destroyer 2 that I'll speak in a second, were obviously, as an objective point of view, way more impactful, at least from the cyber offensive point of view, than Hermetic Wiper was. The other point that is also very peculiar and interesting is that the entire threat intel community saw a couple of interesting quirks. Number one was that we could clearly see that those different waves were being conducted by very different teams with varying levels of experience and also using varying levels of tools. Isaac Wiper, for example, was written in Go language. And it was clearly not similar at all to Hermetic Wiper, which was super effective, while Isaac Wiper was not. Now, some of those things, again, were more effective than others. We don't know whether it was exactly because of the experience of those teams, because of the randomness of the attacks, because of the lack of, I don't know, efficiency or efficacy of those. Again, that's all speculatory. But those data points actually show us that there was definitely different teams working in these waves. The other notable point that I'll mention here is that these tools, for example, were being often compiled 2 hours before the actual deployment, the actual attack. So once more, I would really make stress of this point of how focused they were on creating brand new tools out of their repertoire to be used and burned just in a couple of hours. The other fact that is also very telling is as research went and progressed with time, we found, like for Isaac Wiper specifically, earliest compilations of October 2021. And again, going back to what? The element of preparedness. These teams knew what they were eventually going to face. They knew what was going to happen. And based on the learnings that they've taken for years, they had already their portfolio of tools and resources ready to employ when it was most needed. Love the animation. Now, you might be asking, why so many wipers? Well, there was actually much more than wipers. There was ransomware and data theft, malwares. But in reality, wipers, to an extent, create this telemetrical, I'm sorry, very hard word for me to say, fog of war. It's almost like generation of noise, so that to a point, you are only seeing the attacks that you are meant to see. And it actually shows the reflection of the breadth of activity that we aren't seeing, right? And you can actually spot from even those ransomware or data theft offensives, like Hermetic Ransom, Sonic Vote, many of those were actually fake ransomwares. They were trying to encrypt things that were already destroyed by the wipers before them. And again, they had no way of recovering the information even if you paid it. So it's all about the generation of noise, confusion, chaos, even for the ones, us, collectively, that are trying to discern what is really happening. And again, the other point that I've mentioned already before, it's that philosophy of burnable tool. I'm going to use something, going to compile something that I know that eventually is going to be burnable. But I know that eventually it might not be like the most effective, future-proof tool, so that's okay if people find it out. The other question would be, you tell me if you're asking yourself this question or not, was their use random or tactical? Well, we actually, based on evidences, would like to say both. There were clearly times where this seemed very well structured and planned and executed, other times where eventually it was just randomness. I don't know whether that was because of lack of maturity, of knowledge, or just because they actually wanted to inflict that randomness into the play. Now, okay, I will take you through this journey of wipers, right? And we're going to be basically increasing the severity, as I mentioned before, based on that table that I've shown you previously, on the actual impact of that, that wiper. In this case, I'm going to talk about InDestroyer 2. For those that don't recall or don't know exactly what InDestroyer is, it's a malware designed to interfere with electrical substations, specifically with communication protocols like the IEC 104 that talks with protection relays. So really meant to do physical damage, not data theft, not encryption, not wiping. We're talking about physical damage. And this happened before, like I mentioned previously, in 2016 in Ukraine. And many of the researchers out there actually say that it's one of the most damaging attacks after Stuxnet. Now, you'd be asking, why InDestroyer 2 here on the wiper kind of talk that we have? Well, because it was actually buddied, like followed with all of the other set of tools that was Caddy Wiper, Orc Shred, Linux Shred, Solaris Shred, you can call all of them Shred, to cause maximum damage and inflict maximum entropy into any process of recovery that eventually those teams had in the play. So in April 8, specifically at 1610 UTC, because this was scheduled to be executed, InDestroyer 2 started its attack, and then it was followed by specific wipers targeting specific OSs to do maximum destruction. Important point is that KD Wiper was actually discovered along ISAC Wiper, but in a totally decontextualized way, meaning it was not only used for those ICS level attacks. You can actually see from ESET research that Caddy Wiper was seen in multiple previous attacks, most probably because they were testing it, targeting things like government entities or financial entities, and then later on exactly the energy providers. All right, so last but not least in terms of wipers, the acid rain attack. We kind of already touched this in a previous session. So on 24th of February, exactly on the physical invasion, on the day of the physical invasion, early hours, an attack happened against the Viasat KSAT element, again, the Ukrainian portion of that service, that began with a denial of service, the DDoS, using exactly their own modems, the SurfBeam and the SurfBeam 2 Plus. But not so far down the route, we actually saw those, actually Viasat saw, not we, Viasat saw those modems completely disappearing of the service. And that was like very telling of what is happening. Oh, animations again. Apologies for that. What happened was that the attackers exploited a misconfigured VPN appliance that gave them access to a management network, and they were able to then send specific management commands to all of the modems within their service of Viasat. Now, Viasat initially said that they were not permanently rendering those modems unusable, but we, together with other researchers in the scene, had a different theory. We're actually saying that this was a supply chain attack where firmware cleansing commands were being sent to all of those modems and actually affected like thousands of modems across the world, not only in Ukraine. You can actually see again the targeted modem versus the non-targeted modem of how the firmware was. Now you can think, okay, we know that that didn't actually impact a lot of the the offensives on the Ukrainian side. We can say that probably that was because of companies like Starlink that stepped up and helped Ukrainians to have solid communications for them to conduct their defense operations and offensive operations. And it's not because attackers didn't try to actually breach Starlink. They did. Jamming and interference of communications were being monitored and actively responded by Starlink, and that was actually the success element, the capability of monitoring and response that made their network remain safe, non-jammed and unhacked, and that eventually helped Ukrainians to do a proper defense and offensive by using online communications. And there were like other telcos actually being affected also as part of that. Now the collateral impact of cyber war, as we've mentioned before, because we know that cyberspace doesn't have any borders, oceans, walls, and we can be like 1 second from here into Canada or Portugal or Spain, doesn't matter. And again, the nature of cyberspace itself makes it very, very hard for those attacks to be fully targeted. They will have spillover. They will have a collateral impact into other elements that are not controlled by the attacker itself. And not only Ukrainian customers and modems got affected, for example, as part of the VIA case set, but Italy, Poland, Germany, and many other countries were affected, and thousands of customers were basically rendered without communications. And this is a very notable case of Enercon, 6,000 wind turbines in Germany that simply lost the communications with the monitoring system. Now, thankfully, these wind turbines were capable of operating autonomously without any interruption, but that was really just a scent of what could go wrong if they wouldn't. And eventually, if the lack of communications with the monitoring station could make things, for example, blow up. So what happens now? And I'm basically just finishing. We can eventually ask ourselves, well, is Cyber Armageddon coming in? Well, we don't know. The fact is that we've seen Russia and the cyber threat actors using much more destructive attacks, much more targeted attacks against ICS infrastructure. And we actually saw also threats last week of cyber attacks being used even more exactly to maximize damage, physical damage. Again, I'm not talking about data theft or ransomware or anything like that. So as everyone said in the morning, it's about being cautious. It's about kind of respecting the attacker to an element and making sure that we are prepared in terms of resiliency against it. Now, I'll end with a personal kind of wishful thinking. I know that this is a very complex topic. We kind of approached that in the morning. But as humanity, I think that we still have a long way to go, specifically in making these cyber attacks be seen as war crimes. And again, I'm not a legislator, I'm not a lawyer, this is ultra complex, but again, I think there's ample ground for improvement. And improvement has been made. Exactly, you can see there that the case for war crimes charged against Russia, send more hackers, is actually for the first time being analyzed by lawyers and judges in the Hague court. And to an extent, that is causing somewhat a discomfort into the aggressor, because they have attempted to actually infiltrate the Hague court with a supposedly student that was doing an internship. But again, I'll end up with that personal wishful thinking that we need to do better, and we actually need to criminalize cyber acts much more than we do today. Thank you.
Thank you. The very interesting idea. Thank you. Being personal. Well, maybe a few questions or remarks. Someone, please, if you have anything to ask. Yes, time is running out, but you know,
we can
the
do it
topic
over
is
coffee.
very hot as well. Huh? Yeah, exactly. We can skip coffee.
I'm just a messenger. Don't shoot me the messenger.
Good. No questions, no remarks. So then we stick to the time. Thank you very much. It was so interesting. Also, many things to think about later on.